How y'all doing? For this review, I'm going to review another Gothic, that is, Count Rodric's Castle, or Gothic Times, with an introduction by Hannah Doherty Hudson. Notice I didn't say written by, because no one knows the author of this one. This was published back in around 1795, and like the last book review of The Cavern of Death, they're both in the tradition of Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. And these are Gothics, but they're not Gothic horror like Dracula or Frankenstein. These are Gothic romances. So it involves heroic lords or knights there trying to rescue the women they did love from evil villains. So let's look into it and see what it's about. Just to explain the setting of this, the setting of the story takes place in Lombardy, Italy, which is on the northern end of Italy. And like many such early Gothic romances, it takes place in medieval or late medieval area. It doesn't give an exact date. Best I can say is that it's probably around the 14 or 1500s at the earliest, and the reason I say that because it mentions arquebus is being used, which is a form of primitive gun, so that gives you an idea of the setting, what we're dealing with in the story. Now, the beginning of the book quickly explains the main character story, Rinaldo, who's the son of Count Roderic. He was in the army at the time, and he was while serving in the court at the capital. He meets and falls in love with the beautiful Isabella, who's the daughter of the former king who mysteriously vanishes. The current king, Astolfo, notices the relationship and is not getting Rinaldo in good favor. So, with the warnings of Isabella about this, and at the request of his father here, he wants his son to retire and from the army and to stay with him at his castle far away from Astolfo. And then the story begins from there. So, the story begins with Rinaldo with his trusted servant Ruggiero traveling out through the day, and upon a long journey it gets dark and it storms. They need to find shelter. They find this old castle here, and upon trying to seek shelter they go inside, and when they're investigating they notice some people conspiring to kill one of the prisoners, and that has something to do with another prisoner inside. Long story short, they stop this, and the man they found hidden in a dark dungeon here is Rinaldo's friend, Count Tancred. There's another prisoner that's associated with him in another part, the Lady Aspasia. Both were kept as captives by one Count de Saint-Amand, who, long story short, Rinaldo kills him, but receives a wound on his leg that prevents him from going on further. So, almost out of the blue when you read this, Rinaldo sends Ruggiero to a mission to the capital. Ruggiero is to go to the capital and through a very specific set of instructions find a small covert band of soldiers here. So what is this for? Well, he's not told yet, but he does what he's told. He eventually finds the group, and the group is led by a Count Anselmo. And they're to go by boat at first and then eventually go into the capital, and they're to rescue two ladies in the end. One of them is Isabella, who is Rinaldo's love. The other one is the love of Count Anselmo, which is Eleanor. They also rescue one of their handmaids as well. It almost didn't go well, but eventually they did. So the next parts of the book is them trying to outrun the forces of Astolfo, who sends out his right-hand man, Rudolfo, who's the son of Count de Saint-Amand, who Rinaldo killed earlier in the book. So as they're trying to outrun their enemies, Ruggiero kind of, his horse wears out, so he's kind of left behind for a moment. So the group is focused on, going to hide out in this one mansion. They almost get caught with Rodolfo. They run away, and they find another place to hide for a while. Eventually, Rinaldo does find him, and he explains what happened to him at that time. And long story short, Rodolfo does eventually acquire the two ladies again and captures them, and while the others have to run away from that defeat, Rinaldo finds out that his father's castle is taken over by Astolfo, and his father ends up missing, presumably killed by the king. So the next parts of the book is Rinaldo infiltrating his home in disguise to try and see where the two ladies are so he can rescue them and how to defeat the king. And now I'm going to leave the story at that. And since this is a Gothic romance here, this has all the elements that made Gothics Gothic. Particularly the exploration of the castles that they go through and all this. When Rinaldo and Ruggiero are at the first mansion, escaping a stormy night, trying to stop Saint-Amand, from assassinating Count Tancred and all them, their exploration, as you read it, is pure Gothic and what made famous, starting with Castle of Otranto. Now, in Cavern of Death, it was focused on a cave, but here, castles, at least two, probably a third if you count the mansion that they were hiding in for a moment here, but mostly the beginning and the end. Also, like other Gothics, there's a hint of what may appear to be supernatural elements, whether they are or not. As Ronaldo is trying to infiltrate his own home in disguise, he notices a man that bears his father's armor in the dark. Is it the ghost of his father, or is it something else? There's also a case of hidden identities, or, like for instance, I mentioned Isabella's father being the last king. What happened to him? Did he die or did he disappear? How does that come into play? All those elements you see again from Castle of Otranto are into this in another form. The Hannah Hudson there says it has it's not a plagiarism or anything, it is its own thing, despite the fact that it borrows from others, which a lot of Gothics did, starting from Otranto. Now, I'm not going to say the book is perfect. In fact, there's something about this I think for modern readers may be a bit of a flaw here. Because it's not structured as we're used to having structure in our stories. Now, to understand that, let's take a look at the thickness of this book. Past the introduction, the story is give or take 120 pages. It's not that big. And the last book I did, Cavern of Death, just a little bit less, around 80 pages. But that's okay, because Castle of Otranto is roughly the same thickness between the two. I think it's slightly thicker. These are not long stories. But the way it's structured as it tells the story along, it goes at a very fast pace and allowing characters to be left behind only to quickly catch up and explain, what happened to them and all that. So, for example, when Ronaldo and Ruggiero were traveling throughout the day and they come across the first castle and they do their exploration, they stop Saint Armand from killing Count Tancred. Ronaldo gets wounded in the leg, and because it wasn't that bad, but it starts getting inflamed, so he sends Ruggiero out to the capital. The story, again, it's acting very fast. You just get the impression when they left the castle that we're just going to go on a ride today to explore, see the land and see what we can find. And after that, Ronaldo tells Ruggiero, "Okay, I need you to go to the capital and follow the instructions and search for these men," and he does. Comes out of the blue, and after his instructions and meets the crew and rescue the ladies Isabella and Eleanor, they escape. Now bear in mind, Ronaldo's back in the castle, but as they're running away from Rudolfo, under the surface Astolfo, I know it gets confused with the names here, and I'll get to that shortly. So as they were escaping, they go to a mansion to hide, and then Ronaldo comes back and explains what happened to him in a few days that he was out, and so forth. And so as you read, it tries to go through the story, but when a character is left behind or something, he quickly comes back and explains the situation. This happens about 3 or so times throughout the book. But don't let that deter you, because the point of Gothics is the tone and feel of these classic romance rescue adventures of heroes trying to save women that they love from villains, and it does throw through through the tone and feel of the environment, particularly in castles in this book, but also through caves and what have you. So it's not a perfect book, but think of it from the time of the late 1700s. This is 1795. Castle of Otranto was around 1765. So 30 years, they were writing these stories with these themes into it, and that and people were liking that, so they made more and tried to build up on that. And that's when we started getting more complex, more complete Gothic stories, like The Mysteries of Udolpho by Radcliffe, The Monk by Lewis, or even Gothic horror like Melmoth the Wanderer by Maturin. So you got to start small to get the elements that people enjoy before you build up to something more complex and more complete, at least by our understanding of that. Now, I mentioned the names of earlier, particularly Rinaldo, Astolfo, and Rudolfo. In fact, it's interesting that there is a little note on the text here. They got this, they got it from an old copy there from William Lane's Minerva Press in London, 1794. They did not modernize the spelling or punctuations. They kept all that in. However, this is interesting. The author occasionally loses track of his characters too, referring once to Eleanor as Isabel, and calling Rodolfo Astolfo, once by mistake. These have been corrected for clarity's sake. However, the error referred to in the introduction, Aspasia, Albania, has been retained as their original text. So, now, other than the flaws I told you about the structure on this, with this one, this does, have chapters and is actually in 2 parts. Yeah, something this thick is in 2 volumes here. But as opposed to the Cavern of Death, it's just like one long continuous story, no breaks, no chapters or anything. So that, I think it's just better structure, at least in that account. But with this, it's not that long of a story. Yes, it's kind of very rushed and all that, but it has all the elements that makes a Gothic. And think of yourself as a reader of that time. It's a matter of with no internet, no television, no radio, what have you. You pick up a book like this, and you could read a romantic adventure. But Gothics are defined on how they present the environments that the characters are exploring in. Deep, dark castles or caves or dark landscapes and all that. It's not all pretty and bright and sunshine. But it was through that. This is an example of using those elements in the story that they did and how it influenced a lot of other Gothic stories at the time. I mean, there's probably stuff you probably never heard of. Now, if you are familiar with the basic Gothics, of course, everyone just knows about the Castle of Otranto as the first one. But as I go through the Cavern of Death, the guy who does the Alan Grove, who does the introduction of that, mentions a whole lot of stories here that mentions of, let's see, Castle of Otranto, central hero protects a heroine. Let's see, Harriet Lee's Lothera legend. Cavern of Death, Gothic Quest, let's see, Romance of the Cavern. It's just a lot of stories here on out. There's just on just Cavern itself. Romance of the Cavern, the Haunting Cavern, the Cavern of Strozzi, St. Margaret's Cave, the Cavern of Horrors, the Lady of the Cave. As I say, they take a lot of elements, from other Gothics and trying to make their own story. And later, some writers like Lewis, who did The Monk, and Radcliffe, who did The Mysteries of Udolpho, that's when they expanded it and made it more complex and what the Gothics are famous for. And then later gave way to the Gothic horrors. It's just the interesting evolution of all this, trying to keep, all because of these romance stories with having certain themes of how to present themselves. That's just fascinating with me. So give these a shot. Both of these are, Cavern of Death and Count Roderick's Castle are done by Valancourt Books. Their job is to, not only publish old horrors and stuff like that. One of the things they do is they find old Gothic stories like that you may not ever heard of and give it a new, fresh life. These books have probably not been printed since the time they were the first time, which is the late 1700s. So they found the early copies they could and gave it fresh new editions for us to enjoy. Give them a shot here. So, Count Roderick's Castle, Cavern of Death before in my last video. Find them and hope you can get some influence out of that in whatever way you can. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.